Welcome to the next installment in the Fragmentarium video conference series, where we have the opportunity to hear leading scholars discuss their cutting-edge research in fragmentology, and at the end, to pose questions of them. I am William Duba, Project Manager of Fragmentarium, and your host for this event. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Adrian Papahagi, professor at the Babeş-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania, where he directs the Center for the History of the Book and Texts Codex. Dr. Papahagi's extensive work on manuscripts and on fragments is well known, and today he will be speaking on evidence preserved by destruction, recycling medieval manuscript fragments in Transylvania during the Counter-Reformation. Dr. Papahagi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duba, dear Bill, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. You're quite a big crowd, and I'm overwhelmed by the attendance of this modest, no doubt, conference of mine. Now, you may wonder, what is this horrible, interminable brief, this title that seems to contain everything? Perhaps I was contaminated by the titles of 15th, 16th, 17th century books in which are wrapped in my manuscript fragments, and that's partially true, but I wanted to say as much as possible from the title so as to give you an idea about what I'm going to discuss today. Evidence preserved by destruction is a phrase that I borrowed from Rosamond McKitterick, and she actually used it for palimpsests, not for fragments, but I liked it so much that I keep recycling it in the way the early moderns recycled manuscript fragments. And she said in an article that the most striking feature of palimpsests for the historian is the paradox that they represent evidence preserved by destruction. And this is precisely what we're looking at, because our libri inutiles, the medieval books that were sometimes hated, sometimes despised, sometimes no longer usable for the early moderns in the age of printing and of the Reformation, may have been inutiles in some ways, but certainly not in all ways, because there was also a pragmatic dimension involved. The parchment was precious, and even the paper, as we will see. So it ended up being recycled. So inutilis in one way, it does not necessarily mean inutilis in another. Let me first give you a short historical background about the Reformation in Transylvania, and actually about Transylvania in general, for those of you who are less familiar with this area. We all know what happened in the Reformation, and there are famous books like Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars to tell us how the Mass was abolished and Mass books and breviaries were surrendered in England during the Reformation, how old liturgical books were defaced and abolished, lest their continued existence prove a let to that godly and uniform order which by common consent is now set forth. And sometimes we hear even about ritual acts of destruction, of book destructions, destructions as itself a religious act. All of these well-known manifestations during the Reformation certainly occurred in Transylvania as well. Now, Transylvania at the close of the Middle Ages, actually throughout the Middle Ages and in the early modern age, was a part of the Kingdom of Hungary, which was the, let's say, eastern rampart of Western civilization, alongside with Poland. I keep realizing that the West has pushed east, thank God, including us too. And now it's the Ukraine is the buffer area and no longer us. But we, Transylvania, used to be the buffer area of Western civilization in the Middle Ages. The bishopric of Transylvania, alongside with the See of Chenad and of Oradea, which are nowadays in Romania, were the easternmost Catholic dioceses in Europe, as it were. Today, Transylvania is in the west and north of Romania, as you may know. Now, the Reformation reached Hungary as early as the 1520s, but it didn't take long for Hungary itself to dissolve, unfortunately, under the Turkish conquest of 1526. Transylvania, however, remained an independent principality, and the Reformation soon succeeded, especially in the German-speaking areas, which converted in corpore to Lutheranism. The last Catholic Mass was said in Brașov in 1542. Lutheranism became the official faith of the Saxon nation in Transylvania, and soon Unitarianism and Calvinism joined it in Transylvania. So you had even Protestant denominations fighting each other for primacy. In 1556, the Catholic parishes and orders were suppressed. But in 1579, the first episode of the Counter-Reformation started with Prince Stephen Bathory, who was also King of Poland and Lithuania, inviting the Jesuits to Transylvania. And the college was established in my city of Cluj. We'll talk about Cluj a lot. So at the end of the conference, those of you who didn't know it existed will be quite familiar with it, whether to your dismay or to your great joy, that's to say. And then finally, the Jesuits were chased from Transylvania, but they returned 10 years later and established a school in the outskirts of Cluj in a former Benedictine abbey. So these are the great lines. You have a lot of evidence that medieval books were being recycled during the Reformation. For example, the will drafted by Stephen Bathory V, the grandson actually of the Catholic Bathory. You see in the same family, some were Calvinists, others were Catholics. The great Stephen Bathory was Catholic, but his grandson, Stephen Bathory of Etched, was a Calvinist. And he said in his will that Catholic missals should be destroyed and other large books should be given to schools for pupils to bind their books with. Thank God they did that, because this is why we have some business today, right? And this is why I'm here with you this evening. Now, let's take a look at the history of the book in Transylvania, and let's also try to estimate how much was present there and how much was lost. We certainly have book lists from various parish churches, not very many of them actually. This is one from a little community called Zelna in Romanian, Zendorf in German, Zolna in Hungarian. This is now in Sibiu, and here you can see a book list containing the usual liturgical books. And if you take a look at it, between 1497 and 1559, which was well advanced in the Reformation age, not much was destroyed. One psalter, actually a further psalter was added. The antiphonary were kept, the gradual was still there. The Missalia went from 4 to 3, and of course they start having the German Reformed books, Ein Deutsch Bibel, Ein Deutsch Kanzional und so weiter. There were, of course, other much more important parishes, like the main Saxon city of Sibiu, Hermannstadt, which already in 1424 had 22 liturgical books. It ended up with about 150 books by the mid-15th century. And many of these have survived, although I'm not very sure that these are exactly the same books that were mentioned there. Many of these are certainly not the same books because they come from the later 15th century, but some may be the same books. Very beautifully bound, as you can see. Some of them copied locally. This one was compilavit Dominus Michael Plebanus in Parvo Horeo, a little village outside Sibiu. Pertinetat Fraternitatem Percibinium. So you see this was used locally and it was made in 1394. Generally nice books, good quality local production that you can see there in Sibiu in the late 14th and 15th century. In Cluj Monastery, the oldest Benedictine abbey in Transylvania, a book list survives from 1427. There are also some additions to it, but also some losses. As you see, some losses were occurring already in the Middle Ages. For example, Brother John lost a book and then he was whipped by Brother Thomas, as you can see. Now, how many books were there in Transylvania? The registers of papal tithes for 1332-37, which survives, attest 954 Catholic parishes in Transylvania. Now, if at the end of the Middle Ages, they all had about 5 or 10 books, perhaps even only 5, we may have had about 5 or 10,000 medieval manuscript books in the 15th century. And of course, there had been further books that had been lost in the earlier centuries and so on. But if you look at how much survives from extant book lists, the landscape is really outrageous and appalling. From Jelna, nothing out of 11, 12 attested titles. From Cluj Monastir, nothing, unless some of the fragments that I'm going to talk about today come from there. From important cities, very wealthy cities like Sibiu and Brasov, which had about 150 books at the close of the Middle Ages, actually in the 15th century, almost nothing, Sibiu being the most fortunate case. So all in, one can say that considerably more has been lost in our part of the world than in Switzerland. When you think of St. Gallen, you can't but envy them. Almost everything has been there for the past 14 or 13, let's say at least, 100 years. And so little has survived in our parts of the world. Now, I'm going to focus today on Cluj, my city, and on one particular library, the Library of the Romanian Academy in Cluj, which, as you will see, concentrates the historical collections of our part of the Transylvania. Cluj had 4 main religious institutions in the Middle Ages. One of them is the Benedictine Abbey of Cluj Monastir. As you can see, Monastir is monasterium, monastery. Monostor in Hungarian, Monastir in Romanian. It's a neighborhood. I live there actually nowadays, a very populous neighborhood. The church, destroyed and rebuilt several times, is still standing. St. Michael's Parish Church, of course, a wealthy parish. The Dominican Convent, established pretty late, and the Franciscan Convent, which was being built between 1486, 1516. So it was rather short-lived, only 40 years before the Reformation canceled it. Now, all of these institutions allegedly or attestedly had books. I've already mentioned the inventory of Cluj Monastir drafted in 1427, and there is also some books that were left to the monastery by a Bohemian priest who died there a few years later, which are added by a different hand at the end of the list. So there are more than just this list. 48 volumes, is that much or little? Well, there are very many abbeys that have similar books, although of course Reichenau or St. Gallen had over 400 titles before, in the 9th century already. And the most important Benedictine abbey in Hungary, Pannonhalma, had 73 in the 11th century. So it's not particularly much, but it's something. The Dominicans had a book list. I mean, they intended to draft the book list, but look how frustrating. They said, we had a nice library and so on, and we are going to describe the books, descrivimus in hoc capitolo, and then they don't describe anything, leaving us frustrated, me in particular. No book list follows. There is a note from the 16th century saying that they were dissolved in 1556, and that's all we have from them. Actually, I was able to identify one single book has been identified from the Dominicans in Cluj. It's a modern, it's an incunabulum. And as you can see, it says ad conventus Corosvaliensem usus fratis Jacobi, it should be, of course, Ordinis Predicatorum. That's all we have from them. And this book, and this is something important, entered into the Jesuit collection and was already listed in their catalog of 1604. 1604 is an important year, and you'll soon see why. Now, this shows that the Dominicans somehow left some of their books behind when they were expelled from Transylvania, and perhaps the Jesuits who came during the Counter-Reformation had access to those books. From the Franciscan collection, we only have this late book, also an incunabulum, but the ownership note is from 1544. So also no extant manuscript, but wait and see. As concerns Cluj, the Counter-Reformation, and the Reformation was particularly violent in Cluj. The Protestants plundered the Dominican Convent in 1551. In 1557, that's where they will establish their first school, which is initially Lutheran, then Calvinist, finally Unitarian, and it changes confessions. The Catholic orders are dissolved in 1556. St. Michael's Church is occupied by the Unitarians. The Jesuits come and take them back in 1579. Had the Catholics hidden their books somewhere? Were books left in place? Did they recover some of the old medieval collections? But they're chased again and then return again, and the Unitarians plunder their college in Cluj in 1603. In 1604, I suppose, after that incident, they catalog their books, and this is why so many of them have 1604 written on them. In 1605, they are chased from Cluj again, but they return to Cluj Monastery, not to the city, and maintain a school there until 1693. Then they return to the city and remain there until 1773. The Calvinist college is established around 1608, and they receive the Franciscan building in 1622. So you see, now you have in Cluj three confessional institutions, schools actually, colleges, schools of different degrees that had access to the old Catholic institutions, to their buildings, and perhaps to their books in some way or another, Dominican, Franciscan, Parish, and also the Benedictine Abbey outside Cluj. The Jesuit Cluj functioned on and off as a school or as a college or even as a kind of a university between 1579 and 1773. And this is the period when books were maculated, and that interests us. We find several ownership notes on various books, and here is a very short story of the various institutions, whether a school in Cluj Monastery, a college in Cluj, another school, then an academy in the city, then it became Parish, and finally it became a royal college and a Catholic high school until 1948, when the advent of communism secularized the extant religious institutions. The Unitarian College had existed also on and off since 1557, occupying some of the Catholic buildings in Cluj. And their ownership marks appear on very many modern books wrapped in medieval manuscript fragments. Finally, a Lutheran school was established already in 1545, but the Calvinist one, the Reformed one, is the most important institution, which also existed in a way since 1557, but finally, at least since 1608. So by around 1600 something, all of these institutions exist. Reformed in the city, Catholics in the outskirts, in the Benedictine Abbey. Now, as you will see, all of these institutions were secularized in 1948. The Academy Library was established in that area. The building is later. It's considerably uglier, of course, than all the earlier Gothic things that you have seen, but that's communist brutalism to you, of course. We know that the Middle Ages were dark and modernity is bright. Now this is how bright it got in communist Romania. Since 1952, we have the modern shelf marks, and it's relatively easy to tell what collections books come from, because C stands for Catholic, R for Reformed, and U for Unitarian. So you will know instantly what collection your book and your fragment comes from. Now, the Unitarians certainly had access to the ancient Catholic collections because they were recycling books. They also entered by force, not very friendly, of course, the Catholic institutions, especially the Jesuit College in 1603, And one of the citizens who stormed it says that he found a Roman breviary in membrana conscriptum et in folio tenuem allium, so 2 books. He took home 2 books from the Jesuit institution. And I think that this book, for example, Unitarian 61-782, is a Dominican book, because in the litany, we were lucky to have the litany here. If you look closely, it starts with Sancte Dominice ora pro nobis, then Sancte Francise, here is Omnes Sancti Pontifices, right? So it's quite obvious that the first saint, the first monk, founder of a monastic order, is Saint Dominic. Sancte Dominice ora pro nobis, Sancte Francise ora pro nobis, Sancte Benedicte. They should have started with Benedict normally, and Anthony, not with Dominic. So perhaps this was a book that they recovered from the Dominican convent. When we take it off, perhaps we will discover more. The Jesuits themselves recycled the Libris Inutiles. You shouldn't think that the Protestants hated them so much that they recycled them. No, I think pragmatism ruled, and the access to books ruled this. I started my research by trying to identify what books may have come from Cluj and not from elsewhere. And the most obvious thing to me appeared to look at books printed in Cluj, which have been kept in Cluj since they were printed, in this case 1597, and which were bound in manuscripts. Consequently, I would infer they were also bound in manuscripts in Cluj. Whether the fragments came from Cluj or were produced elsewhere, that's another argument, and we'll come to it. This is an example, and indeed 2 copies in the Academy Library are wrapped. This is a missal from the 15th century, wrapping this Silverschick copy. This is a book that my colleague Gabriela Gilani from Budapest knows very well, because we wrote an article about it together. And I'll talk about it more in a moment. A gradual that may also have been used locally. But other copies of the same book in other cities in Transylvania are also wrapped in medieval manuscripts, perhaps of local provenance, perhaps coming from Cluj, God knows. So one of my first questions was about the provenance of fragments and their relevance for local history. Now, this is what Bill Duba wrote about this fragment. I liked it very much. He called it the most Franciscan thing ever. This is obviously not a product of Cluj, right? You remember that the Franciscans only started building their church there in 1486. This is a early 14th century copy of Ricardus de Mediavilla, made most, I would say obviously in Paris. Did this book belong to the Franciscans in Cluj, or did it come with, here is a larger picture of it, or did it come with the printed book, which belonged to the Jesuits in Cluj, but only later, you see 1764, and it was printed in Prague. Where was the book bound? Sometimes we have that information. Here is another university book, the Summa Halensis, Alexander of Hales, also a Franciscan. But in this case, we are lucky enough to have a note from the owner of the book, from the early modern owner of the book in 1634. This is also a Unitarian from Cluj. He is known from literature, but he tells us that he bound this book, he bought this book in Venice, Materia constat Venetiis denaris, I suppose 40 Venetis. He bought it for 40 Venetian whatever, pence, let's say, and compactio autem, one would say Pisoni, but I suppose it's Posoni, and I don't know why this I was added, and that's obviously Pozsony, Bratislava. He bound it in Bratislava and paid for the binding 35, mind you, Hungarian sou, which is almost as much as the book, right? But we know for sure that this book was not bound in Transylvania. It came with the binding. So the first problem we have to ask is, where do the bindings come from? Are they relevant for local collections or not? And this is why, with the program that we are doing, we have decided to unbind some of these fragment manuscripts and books, actually, and to take a look at what's underneath. And you will see we can have quite some surprises. Now, this manuscript is obviously not a product of Transylvania. Books were not produced in Transylvania in 1150 at this level, and certainly not Otto von Freising's Chroniken. This is most likely a Bavarian book, and a very pretty one, and a very early one, I would say, because I looked at the Munich copies, the earliest Munich copies of Otto von Freising's Chronicle. Now, we took it off. We only have the money to take off 21 of these copies because they need to be done in a laboratory outside Cluj. It's a bit expensive, but we are doing it for 21 copies. I chose some of them because they are old, others because I thought them relevant for local history. And here you are. We were able to identify, I was able to identify the text pretty easily. That was not difficult. If you compare it to Codex Latinus Monacensis 1003 from the second half of the 12th century, it's pretty similar. And if you do a little paleographical analysis, and you will see the shape of the final S, the ampersand, the e caudata, the V and U, I think you will agree with me that it's a book made in the second half of the 12th century rather than in the early 13th. Now, when we took it off, two pieces of cardboard corresponding to the two covers, of course, were identified. And the cardboard itself is made from recycled paper from printed books. And I was able to identify these. I was very glad when I did that. These come from a book. And now look how interesting it gets. A book, you see it's the same page 174, but the book was printed in Cluj. You see Kolozs Varbon 1619, which shows me that most likely the Otto von Freising manuscript fragment was used in the binding in Cluj. And I think I have even identified the book, the copy from which the paper was extracted to make cardboard. It's this one, which lacks the pages up to 335. And the latest I get is 174. So they all come from the lacking part, from missing part of the printed book. So this is a book printed in Cluj. Mind you, the Unitarians from Cluj, it's a Unitarian book also. The Unitarians from Cluj we still have at the Academy Library 16 copies of it. So of course they had plenty, so they used some of it for cardboard. Where did they get the Freising, the Otto von Freising copy? Certainly, I don't think it circulated in Transylvania. I think it came directly as maculature for wrapping. But it's not always like that. Now, let's look at this one. This is an Italian missal. And you see here the Jesus Maria note, which shows that the Jesuits used it. It certainly belonged to the Jesuits. It's very erased, so it's not very easy to identify the text, but I did eventually manage to identify it, comparing it to these beautiful Vatican manuscripts. Here you have the Post Communio Protegat Nos Domine, and it's that, and even here you can read non dum quidem de festis and so on, right? And luckily, two fragments seem to come from the same bifolium. I only realized that when I was able to identify all the texts, and I realized that this is the beginning of the Annunciation Feast. By the way, that was yesterday, so it's quite topical. This is the beginning of the Annunciation, and this is why you have this beautiful initial, which to me looks Italian. It looks very similar to this 14th century one. Look at the white tendrils here, and perhaps this was also the typical Italian pig. Look also at the blue field and so on. Now, this certainly was not Transylvanian, but did it belong to the Dominicans or to the Franciscans from Cluj? Was this copy used locally? These were certainly also not local products. 3 liturgical manuscripts in German, these are not very frequent. I haven't studied these yet. We are still waiting to detach them. But of course, the German speakers among you will soon be interested by these 3 books. And they're not known to literature, Bolyai, so we could write about them. One of them is known, but not the 2 others. Where do they come from? Well, when you open the books, you will see that the books are also manuscript books. And in the manuscript books, we have annotations of the student who said, Sub Reverendo Patre Alexandro Donati Franciscus Pelzman. And he also says when he finished it in 1695. If you look this up, the Reverendus Pater Alexander Donati was a professor at the Jesuit College in Graz. He also published books. So most likely our Transylvanian student studied in Graz, not most likely, certainly. He studied in Graz and bound his notebook there. In the other manuscripts, you have other teachers. All of them can be identified at the Graz Jesuit College. So you see the Jesuit networks, the Jesuits from Cluj studying abroad in Graz, Gloyach, Hieronymus Milzer, Franz Wensauer, all these were teachers around, this is 1671, not 1471, obviously. These were teachers in Graz. So this is a manuscript that comes from Graz. But some of them, I think, are local products. And here is one that is particularly relevant. Fragment 11, we give them new shelf marks when we detach them. So this Unitarian book is wrapped in a fragment. You see it belonged to a Unitarian teacher from Cluj. It also has a very beautiful decorated initial. Now, if you look attentively, and once it has been unwrapped, you can see that it finishes, it has the Feria Secunda, you see here at the top, Feria Secunda Invitatorium, and then on the previous page, which would be the recto of this, you have the end of the Athanasian Creed, Quicumque vult, and here is the ending of the Athanasian Creed, Haec est fides catholica, quem nisi, whatever, you know that. Now, as you well know, the Athanasian Creed was included at the end of the Dominica in the Roman type, and this was also followed by the Franciscans. But in Transylvania, they generally ended the Feria Prima, the Dominica, with Psalm 25, 26, Judica me Domine, you can see it here, and then Dominus Illuminatio Mea, Psalm 26, 27. There is no Athanasian Creed in the Psalters surviving from Transylvania. I will show you this one from Brasov. You see also the end of Psalm 25 and the beginning of 26 for the Feria Secunda. Here too, I'm not sure this is from Transylvania, but it may be. You don't have the Dominus, the D, because it was, of course, excised from the manuscript. It must have been beautifully illuminated and it was taken off. And also in the printed copies. But in Franciscan sources, including Transylvanian ones, 2 Transylvanian Psalteria Ferialia, you can have this Fideliter firmiterque crediderit, salvus esse non poterit. This is the end of the Athanasian Creed, and here is the Dominus Illuminatio Mea, right? So in the Franciscan Transylvanian liturgical psalters, you do have the Athanasian Creed. Consequently, I have good reasons to think that my fragment comes from the Franciscan Convent, which is only 200 yards away from the place where the manuscript is now, and where the Jesuits, but also the Unitarians had access. And obviously in this case, the Unitarians had access to this former Franciscan book. Now this book also corresponds to a series of other liturgical books large. You can see all of them are pretty large, from 500 to 635 times 380, 410. So large choir books. All of them produced around 1500. So they certainly renewed their liturgical books in Transylvania around 1500. And I'm going to show you just a few. This is Brukenthal in Sibiu, but actually it was made for Brașov. And you see a later hand added some music and also dated one of the initials, 1552. That's very nice. And added songs in German here, Gott, aller Schöpfer, right, erbarme dich unser und so weiter. In Sighișoara, this splendid antiphonor made in 1506, it's dated, as you can see, anno 506. This famous Vigiliale also dated from Sibiu in 1507. This nice gradual from the secular area made in 1524. And I suppose this one too, Bill, the one you publicized a few days ago, also a very large book. This is half the size of the width. It must have been a book that was 600 millimeters high. Also looks early 16th century, perhaps even 1520s. We have some annotations from 1623, and perhaps this Zereda, and I'm asking here my Hungarian colleagues if this could be, you see here you have Salomon Zereda. Is this perhaps Csík-Zereda? Is this the Transylvanian city? Is this common in early modern Hungarian to say Zereda rather than Sereda? I don't know Hungarian that well to tell. So it's up to you to tell me when this is over. These are certainly from Cluj. We have here the former director of the Batianeum Library. She knows the book these fragments come from. Two of them were already known to Kilian Szigeti. The third one I discovered recently. All these fragments come from the gradual of St. Michael's Parish Church in Cluj, which I think was made shortly before 1528, when this clasp, this metal clasp, was dated. Although you may not believe me, this is two. The blacksmith who did it, the ironsmith, was not very literate, but I'll tell you why this is 1528 and not 1538 or 58 or anything else. The reason is this. In 1528, they made this new Renaissance porch to the sacristy, to the chapel. And although now in their, I shouldn't say stupidity, but anyway, they covered it in wood. In ancient albums, you can see that the door was dated 1528. Can you see the 28 here? 28. 28 was there at the bottom of the right-hand side column, so to say. So I think that when they made this iron gate, they also ordered a new clasp, a new binding for their gradual, which must be consequently must predate 1528. All right, but sometimes our membra disiecta don't end up in Cluj and Alba Iulia, 100 kilometers away, but they end up in Cluj and Budapest. Here is a fragment that, a couple of fragments, four actually, membra disiecta from the same Transylvanian and maybe from Cluj, a manuscript from Cluj that we wrote about in fragmentology. Two fragments are at the Library of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest and at the National Archives in Budapest. Another one, actually two further ones are in Cluj. This is one that we discovered a few years ago. But if you look at the origin, at the provenance of the books in Budapest, this is the Academy Library in Budapest. We know that this fragment comes from the book Története F256, and it says Kolozsvári nyomtatványa. So it's a printed book from Cluj. Quite interestingly, the book was given by Adam Teleki, who was a landowner near Cluj. But even more interestingly, this book and this one have the same Unitarian owner. because this one belonged to the same Radecius. You see here Valentini Radeci. Valentinus Radecius was a Pole who was the rector of the Unitarian College in 1605, right after the sack of the Jesuit college. So I suppose he had access to some of the books there. And I think both of these were local. So here is the advantage of taking these manuscripts of their books. This belonged to the Jesuits in 1604, and I suppose Radecius got to it in 1605 after the Jesuits were chased, which means that they too left books behind them when they were chased from the college. Quite interesting. I'm only beginning to understand these things now. So here we are. This is fragment 14 from a book printed in Cluj. All of them are undoubtedly from Cluj local books. But some of them are relevant for other collections in our region. This is a famous book. It's called the Antifonale Varadiense or Varadinense. In Hungary, it's also known as the Zalka Antiphonary. It was a famous book ordered in Prague by the Bishop of Oradea, John Filipek, who was bishop there from 1476 to 1490. Now, the main bulk of the antiphonary is in Győr, nowadays in Hungary. It was taken there from Oradea. But when I saw this fragment in Cluj, it was detached without any note of provenance. What's made me recognize it was this particular dotting of the I. And if I instantly compare, actually I was in Hungary when I realized that, and I called my colleagues from Cluj to measure the distance between the lines of the staves. They fit. And then of course, I already had the Exaudi. There is very little text on it, but thank God for that peculiar dotting of the I. Here is a second fragment from the same magnificent liturgical book, bound in another reformed book from Cluj. If you compare the initial G's here, ours, of course, is very erased, very worn out. But if you look at the original book, which is well kept in Győr, you will see it's the same thing. Just compare these spiritus or the R in the responsoria, and you will realize it's the same book if you had any doubts. And thank God we found it early enough for my friend Zsuzsa Czogányi to include it in her splendid edition facsimile of the Antifonale Varadiense. And this fragment of ours comes from the same page as a fragment which is now in Slovakia in Modra, to see how they circulate. It's incredibly fascinating. But our book did not stay in Transylvania, although it comes from a book which was bought in Alba Iulia, not far from Cluj. Actually, this book was given to the Reformed College in Cluj by the Hungarian National Library. It was a duplicate there. So you see, a book from Oradea travels to Hungary, enters, comes back to Transylvania, then it goes to Budapest, then it ends up in Cluj. How much this book has traveled, including the fragment and the modern book. And I'm done here. I've just highlighted a few of our fragments. And I should add that the project that we are currently doing in Cluj, these fragments are present on Fragmentarium. Those that haven't been detached yet are not yet on Fragmentarium, but those that bear the shell marks, Fragmentum Codicis Latini 1, 2, 3, 4 are available on Fragmentarium. There is also a conservation side to this project because the books were in this piteous state. I mean, this is when I took them out from the stacks. But anyway, all of them highly worn, dirty, in a pitiful state. This is when I started grouping them by shelf marks and so on. But now the fragments all have their own folders, their own shelf marks. They exist as independent items in our collections. The books from which they have been extracted have been rebound also well conserved, and this is an example for you too, Doina, in the Batianeum. You should do this to all the manuscripts, put them in boxes so that they are not destroyed anymore. Here is the beautifully rebound copy of the book, the cardboard elements nearby, and the fragment well kept in its own folder. So now all of these are safe, and we hope that the next 500 years will be kinder to them than the previous ones. And I'm done, Bill, so that no one should resent my exceedingly long, interminably brief presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thank you very much. We have time for some questions. First, there was a straight comment from Ladislav Alexandru Horvat, who says that yes, Česká Zrada is there. That's what.
Thank God. All right. Thank you very much. I'll take that. Well, on Fragmentarium, I did venture to say that, so I don't have to correct it. Thank you for confirming this.
And Marie-Louise Heckman says, observes that the insertion of German songs of church could be a trace to Lutheran reuse.
Certainly, yes. And I noted that. And that's also very interesting. They didn't discard them. They reused them for how long, I don't know, but certainly in the mid-16th century, they were still reusing Catholic missals. That's something I would like to know, but I haven't yet found any reliable literature on it. How long did the Lutherans reuse or still use Catholic liturgical books, song books, or if you can tell me, I'm interested in that.
So the next one is in German. I'll just read it in English and in translation, and it's from Balaz Neems, who says, "Dear Adrian, what about German language fragments? Are they exclusively imported texts?"
The three that I showed you, certainly. I have also found a few others. I can't tell before perhaps if we manage to take them off, we will find more information in the, but I can't tell yet. However, I do not think that they're of local. I don't think that the Transylvanian Saxons at that time produced liturgical manuscripts in, if they were, I don't know, Sachsenspiegel or vocabularies, I would say yes. But we have famous fragments from Transylvania, you know them very well, the Marienlied from Mediasch and others. So I don't know, for the time being, they are not so numerous. They don't look locally produced. These ones, I'm sure they come from Graz. I'm waiting to take them off, to examine them on both sides, and then to look for similar manuscripts, of course, in Graz and elsewhere. And I hope to, perhaps we can find something about them. Yes.
Great. Peter Toth asks if you have encountered any fragment in Hungarian or maybe in Latin with medieval vernacular Hungarian annotations or glosses.
I would have liked that, but no, none. Of course, you have Hungarian annotations, but all of them are early modern, and they belong to the owners of the printed books in which the fragments, wrapped with the fragments. So they are not medieval or contemporary or no. Unfortunately, not.
All right. Susanna Zagani, if I get that right, says, "Great presentation, dear Adrian. Thanks. Is the restoration of medieval fragments for Romania going on systematically, or is this process concentrated on some institutions?"
I wish. It's concentrated only here at the Academy Library in Cluj, but we hope to set a good example to everybody and to encourage them to apply for funding and to do it. We have great numbers of manuscripts all over Transylvania and all the major collections in Alba Iulia, in Sibiu, in Brașov. We have started here, and for the time being, we're only restoring 21 fragments in this project. I'm going to describe a few more on Fragmentarium, but we have 200 at this library alone. So ultimately, yes, it is systematical, but it's only a beginning. So I wish it were as widespread as it is systematical.
Okay. And next we have from Lucian Alexandrescu asks, what are the oldest Catholic texts that were reused to bind books, Transylvanian or otherwise? Did the age of texts, in case of early medieval examples, redeem them, or were they pragmatically repurposed with regard to their age, without regard to their age?
Yes. Well, I think that didn't matter very much, but it's unlikely to find Carolingian manuscripts in Transylvania. The Tartar invasion of 1241 obliterated everything that had existed before. So practically nothing predating 1241 exists in Transylvania, very little in Hungary, as some of you know. Basically, the Transylvanian manuscripts that we have are 14th and 15th century products. But so my assumption is that whatever is 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th is foreign. We have found 3 Carolingian fragments. One of them looks really late 8th century, so not even 800, and it looks like a Bible, but I have compared it. I'm not going to tell you which it is, because then you'll go and write the article. And it's not in Cluj, it's elsewhere. And it's very tiny, but the open G's that it has and the open A's, I mean, they're all the merkmale of a very early Carolingian Bible, and also very large. I have been able to identify what passage. It's only about 2 inches or something like that, very tiny patch. And there is a nicer one in Bucharest. So there are 2 or 3 Carolingian ones, several early medieval ones in Cluj, a few from the 12th century, a few university books from the 13th and 14th, but mostly we are looking at late medieval liturgical books from the 14th and 15th century. And those could be local, and they also interest me for the purposes of local history.
Okay. Eva Veselovska says, thank you very much, Adrian. The lecture was perfect. Will these new found fragments be published in the online databank Fragmentarium?
Yes, and some of them already are. And by the way, I'm asking the musicologists among you, Eva, you, Gabi, Zsuzsa, if you can tell me more about the musical aspect, the liturgical aspect of those fragments that I have published online. I'm a philologist, I'm not a musicologist, I'm not a liturgist, and my interests were initially early medieval. So if you find more that you can say about those 14th and 15th century liturgical books that you know so well, please write to me and I'll update the descriptions on Fragmentarium. Of course, that will bother Bill, who will have to take them off and put them up again. But I mean, if we can improve the descriptions, why not? I've done my best, but I can only do that much. All right.
I'm only happy to do my job, so it's really a pleasure to update these things. Thomas Falmania says, "Proficiat, bravo! Are there really about 180 fragments in the project?" You missed the beginning there. Paleographically, what would be the proportion of Italian, German, and French origin for the 14th and 15th century?
Yes. I'm happy to greet you. Bonjour, Thomas. Well, 189 in the Academy Library in Cluj, 189. And I haven't counted the ones that are inside incunabula as fly leaves or paste downs. It's only wrapping early modern books or detached. So about 200 would be a safe assumption, or perhaps a bit over 200. Similar numbers in Alba Iulia, Sibiu, less in other places. I think we are looking at about 1,000 in Romania, roughly speaking. in this project that is being financed right now by the Ministry of Culture, we've only included 21. I will describe more for Fragmentarium. We already did describe some with the students of FIDEM DM, and I'm going to do a bit extra, but eventually I hope to detach them all. Now, paleographically, 98% Central European, a few university, French university books, a few Italian liturgical, but really you count them on your two hands. 99%, 98%. German, Austrian, some of them look distinctly Austrian, some of them German, Bavarian for some older ones, some of them may be local products, some some are Bohemian, Central European, I would say, not over 95%.
Okay, and Thomas Falmania replies, 1,000, okay, it's about the same in Luxembourg. You also had a reply from Zana Zagani that they're ready to collaborate. And
I already know that.
So the next question here is Gabriela Gilani, says, it was really fantastic. Question, here's a clarification question. You mentioned that you had discovered new fragments from the Cluj Kosovar gradual of the St. Michael Church. Did she understand that well?
Yes, one more. And not a chance that I should discover any further fragments, not here, because I've seen everything. So yes, 2 were already known, and now I've found a third one, but it's really just a little strap on the spine of a book, so it won't bring very much. One of them, however, is interesting, and when we take it off, we will see more of it because it also has a page number, so we know what page it comes from, and the main bulk of the book is at Alba Iulia. So now we must start internal Romanian diplomacy and administrative, I don't know, castet, to be able to bring the manuscript from Alba Iulia to Cluj for the exhibition, or at least to photograph it entirely. And as it belongs to us in Cluj, you should allow us to do that. Otherwise, I'll be very angry and start making a great fuss nationwide. All right. Okay.
Deborah Lacoste chimes in with an offer for help. We would be pleased to create inventories of the fragments that contain enough visible chant on the Cantus database with links to the Fragmentarium images, and maybe they can help with descriptions and notations on both sites.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Well, of course, I'm using Cantus all the time to identify, so I'm so glad that you exist. I don't know what I'd be doing without you. So thank you very much, Deborah. Certainly, I'd be honored. You can see them on Fragmentarium, and if you have anything to add or to correct, please write to me. And yes.
And finally, we have Peter Toth asking, you only hinted at this in your brilliant presentation, but are there plans for a similar project in the Batianeum in Alba Iulia as well?
Yes, Doina Biro, who was director there until a few years ago, and I photographed almost 200 fragments there as well. They had been detached by the 19th century, early 20th century librarian Sentivani. They are kept in folders, and we plan to study those too. But we need to find to finance that. Also to do, they were taken off. Sometimes the shelf marks of the printed books were put down, but in other cases, we have to identify the books they were extracted from. So that too involves a great amount of work. But yes, it should be done. When and who and well, that's another question.
There's one last question. We'll get one last in before we finish here. And that's Thomas Falmania. Peut-être une chance plus forte d'avoir une cohérence pour l'origine des fragments.
Ça dépend. Ça dépend. The collections in Cluj and Alba Iulia are distinct. Batiani bought his books abroad. Most of those books come from Austria and from Slovakia. from 2 libraries, and some of them belonged to Migazzi, the Archbishop of Vienna. And I have discovered that he bought them from different institutions in Austria after the secularization of Joseph II. So he bought them, for example, a lot of them come from the former Dominican Convent in Leoben in Steiermark. Some of them come from Graz. He has a lot of them coming from Trentino Alto Adige. He was from there. He has a lot of them coming from the Jesuits in Vienna. You have sub-collections. There's a huge work to be done there. But those are not relevant for local history, Thomas. Those in Cluj, however, as I have shown for the Membra Bisiecta, may be relevant for local collections. And this is why I'm starting here, because as I was saying in the beginning, so little has survived that any fragment is precious. And this is why fragmentology for us is more than it may be for someone in St. Gallen or in Paris. In Paris, come on, you have 100,000, 200,000 manuscripts. Who cares for a few wrappers? But we care for every single wrapper, I would say. So yeah, in Cluj, there will be a coherence about origin. In Alba Iulia, it will mainly be all over Western Europe. But it will be more interesting for people from other countries, because you will have Paris fragments, Italian ones of all. So there will be a great many origins.
Wow, well, thanks again. I mean, it's very exciting to hear about your work. And with that, this concludes today's video conference. The next conference is scheduled for the 23rd of April, 2021, when Dr. David Rundle of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of Kent will speak on Neil care and the tradition of studying fragments in the UK. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next time.